Hi there, I'm Simon, and this is a short talk, about 25 minutes, about the issue of liminality, and especially how it relates to what we often call native speaker and non-native speaker teachers. As you can see, it's got two titles. I encourage you to choose whichever title you think is best. And also notice that there's a QR code here. If it's too much, then you can scan the QR code and that will take you to the video on my LinkedIn account and also some of the background reading. Okay, so let's start with what's the big idea here? Where does this idea of native and non-native speaker come from? Well, of course, we all have our own ideas about these things, but for me, my experience of this goes way back to the early 90s when I read Peter Medye's book about this, about native and non-native speakers. And I was really enthralled and interested in the idea right from the start that he wanted to notice the differences between those two different kinds of teachers and also see where their equal strengths were. A bit later on, I came across a slightly different idea. That's Adrian Holiday's idea. And we could say that this maybe is much more of a political perspective. The idea that there is an ism here, which is that some groups of people, i.e. native speakers, have preferential treatment and other people, non-native speakers, are prejudiced against because of their backgrounds. And this obviously affects the way that people are treated, including things like how they're employed in language schools. But also, I don't need to tell you this because we see this on a daily basis. Here's an example from a Reddit that I saw only a couple of weeks ago. A situation that I know I'm very familiar with from my experience, and I'm sure that most of you will also will have experience or two, whether it's at a kind of quite severe level like this, or maybe just on more informal, maybe less noticeable ways. So, what's my big idea today? Well, so this idea of native speakerism, a distinction between the native speaker and the non-native speaker teacher, it's been around a long time, as we've already seen. And you've probably already got your own ideas about it. I imagine for most of you, the people in this room, you're probably thinking, I don't want it to be a big deal. I don't want it to be something that forces me to recruit or to employ some people and not others. But it's a situation that still is with us. So my idea today is really to kind of move away from that traditional dichotomy of one or the other and see if we can find a way maybe that can describe something where both native and non-native speaker people can be seen together, and where they are both facing similar issues, similar challenges, and have similar values. And the work of Deleuze and Guattari, I think, is often very good for this kind of thing. One of the reasons why is that, Felix Guattari was a psychologist, and he wanted to reject and push back against the traditional psychological ideas of what is normal is right, and that anybody who lacked what is normal is psychologically problematic, and instead he was looking for ways that people produce their desires, people become something new, and that's where we spend our time and focus our energies. Also, part of Deleuzian thought is the idea that when it comes to kind of imagining, thinking, making sense of the world, what we really need to do is to create concepts, and the concepts will change and allow us to make sense of the change. So I've got a concept for you, and the concept is liminality. Now this word, as you can see from here, this word's been around for a long time because it's the Latin word for a doorway. So this was probably a fairly common word for the Romans. However, it kind of went out of use. It went out of use for a long time, and it came back probably the beginning of the 20th century. And as you can see on the little graph that we've got here, by the mid 20th century, it started to increase in its use until in recent years it's become much more common. So why has this word that starts off meaning a doorway and a threshold, why have we started to use it more in modern English? Well, I guess that goes all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. As you can see here, 1909, with Arnold van Gennep, who was an anthropologist, and his most famous book was this idea called the rites of passage, which I'm guessing that most of you have heard something along the lines of the word rites of passage. You already have an idea what it means. Well, Gennep was the first person to use this, as far as I'm aware, and what he was interested in the way that things change, especially how individuals, say, when they're young, go through a process where they seem to be separated from their parents. Then they go through a transitional stage before they are reincorporated into their families or reincorporated into societies. And this stage in the middle, this transitional stage, Van Gennep called a liminal period. So here are some more examples of rites of passage and liminal periods. So, for example, in some societies, the idea of having a tattoo, which is an indicator maybe of moving from childhood into adulthood, is fairly common. But even in societies that don't have something quite as physical as that, there are other things that we do. So the other picture, we can see a group of kids getting ready to go for their prom. Again, another liminal experience of moving between childhood and adulthood. But interestingly, the idea of rites of passage didn't really take off, and Van Gennep's idea wasn't really heard about very much until the 1960s. Maybe one reason for this was because the book hadn't been translated from French into English until 1960. So maybe a lot of people just didn't get the chance to read it. But by 1967, Victor Turner read Van Gennep's earlier book and realized that the concept of liminality can be extended to talk about any social situation or any experience that any human being has. In particular, he thought that we needed to extend it in both time and in space. So let's have a look at some examples of that. So you may already have heard these described as liminal spaces, but let's try. Say, for example, an airport is a liminal space. We are between one place and another. But another way could be seen as the church doorway. It's a liminal, almost literally a liminal space, in the sense that by moving through the doorway, we go from let's say a secular, into a spiritual domain. The idea of graduation. Well, here we've got liminality as time, as an event. So the graduation is a time when we move from youth, from childhood, maybe from education into, again, adulthood or the rest of our lives. So graduation is a time, a period that we celebrate. Also, we've got a picture here of revolution. Well, revolutions are liminal spaces as well, where there is a transition, a change from what has been before to becoming something else. In a revolution, of course, it's a violent change from one state to another. And also, finally, we've got this picture of COVID-19. So probably you can imagine that when we were social distancing, there were lots of liminal spaces and liminal time. But especially in terms of time, probably most of us are sort of aware of the idea that, well, at least I don't know about you, but for me, where I still kind of talk about what happened before COVID and what's happened after COVID. It's a liminal space. And I also remember that there was a time when we talked about the new normal. Do you remember that? Well, that was very much a focus on the liminality, of the awareness that during the COVID years, we were between two periods of time. So, how does that relate to language schools? Well, here we've got 4 people. Let's say that one of them is a beginner student. They're in a period where they're learning English for the first time, maybe coming into a language school for the first time, being in a classroom maybe for the first time in many years. So all of these will be situations where they're stepping over thresholds. Well, they'll be moving into new spaces where maybe they've never been before. But maybe another one of these people is a more advanced student. Let's say an intermediate level student. And this student is looking to step across, above the intermediate plateau. Let's say that they're an IELTS student who's looking to get from 5.0 to 6.5 because they want to go to study in a university in another country. Again, lots of liminal space here, lots of opportunities for them to cross boundaries, to cross thresholds. But another one of them could be a non-native speaker teacher. Maybe this is a person who maybe they've completed their CELTA or something like that, but maybe they're looking to cross a new threshold by doing Delta. Maybe their thresholds are thresholds of their confidence. Maybe they feel, maybe because there are lots of different kinds of teachers in their school, that they're lacking in experience and they're looking how to gain experience. Maybe they feel they lack knowledge. Maybe they feel they lack credibility. All of these are things which can be seen as liminal spaces. But maybe the other person is a native speaker teacher, but they're living in another country. So they're also having very liminal experiences. Just getting in the bus or going to the shop could be a liminal experience of crossing a threshold, trying to use a new language maybe that they've never studied before and in which they're just learning. They're meeting new people in a new culture. Again, a liminal experience. And that doesn't take into account all of the fact that they're working in a new country, maybe learning new ways of work, maybe learning new styles of teaching or dealing with the local culture. So what we can see within a language school is that the learners, the teachers, whoever they are, and of course also the managers, people like us, we're all in liminal places. We're always all constantly crossing thresholds. However, as Gilles Deleuze would tell us, concepts are not fixed. Concepts are there to always lead us to new questions, to challenge us to think in new ways. And so, even as I was just telling you that little story, you might be thinking, well, this liminality, it might seem like a good thing, but can't we imagine lots of situations where liminality is a bit scary? Just think about something like culture shock for a moment, right? That's a liminal experience, which can be quite an unpleasant one. Also, we got the idea of being betwixt and between something, but what are we betwixt and between? In some cases, if I'm talking about IELTS bands, for example, we've got a pretty clear idea of what those 2 points might be. But again, when I'm moving to a new country or learning a new language or forming relationships between new people, what am I between? What am I becoming? It's not easy to know. And well, maybe a more complicated question, but it's the question that I'm asking in this talk, which is, if I've created a concept of liminality and I'm using it as a narrative to describe the fact that I don't really need to worry about who's a native speaker and who's a non-native speaker, because actually we're all in the same boat. We're all in this process of constant change and crossing boundaries and crossing new thresholds. Well, how do I make sense of that in terms of shaping something as complicated, as complex as a school? Well, as managers, probably when it comes to making sense of our situations and thinking what we might be doing next, we often use kind of modeling techniques like SWOT or PEST or VSM. I don't know if you know that one. That's one more to do with customer journeys. But I wanted to introduce to you today, as the second part of this talk, the idea of a different kind of mapping system. So, as I've already said, making something happen is hard. I think you may have noticed that this year, 2024 at least, word of the year was manifesting, and Dua Lipa seemed to have had a big part to play in that. Now, for her, it seems that this is kind of like she writes it down on a piece of paper and she kind of really wants it to happen. To be fair to her, it does seem to happen for her. But I'm not sure that's going to work quite so well when I want to make a change in a language school. So for this, I'm going to turn to David Snowden. Now, David Snowden's famous in the world of complex adaptive systems for humans, and also in what do we do when we're trying to make changes, to make sense of what's going on, and how do we make the sense so that we can go into the future? Well, this is actually a very new idea for mapping. And just bear in mind, again, because we're all managers and that kind of people here, this is an approach that is not only for making changes to the narrative around liminality and how acceptable are native and non-native speaker teachers. You could use this for all changes. And it's called estuarine mapping. So for those of you who maybe are not very familiar with estuaries, I would recommend, while you're in Edinburgh, go up to the top of one of those very tall hills and look to the north, and you'll see the Firth of Forth, which is a very, very excellent example of an estuary. So an estuary is kind of like a river, but the difference is it's tidal. So water goes both ways. The tide comes in from the sea and the tide goes out from the river. So we get salt and fresh water mixing and mingling in the estuary. Now, David Snowden thinks that this is a particularly good metaphor for the complexity that happens in organizations. There is some predictability in the way that the water comes in and out of the estuary. We can set that our watches by when the tide changes sometimes. But that doesn't cover all of the bases. Estuaries are full of rock, they're full of sand, they move, the water swirls in strange ways and creates currents, so that actually the movement of the water within an estuary and the tidal change is never the same 2 days in a row. So how can we make sense of this level of complexity? Well, according to David Snowden, what we do is we start by thinking about the affordances, i.e. that's kind of where do we think things might be able to go. But also we need to map the constraints. What is it about the current system that's holding back a change? And we also need to think about the actors, or the actants, we might call these people, who are the people that have, to some degree, agency in making change. So once we've got all of these points, we start to map them onto X and Y coordinates. The horizontal coordinates relates to time. how things will change over time. And then the the vertical coordinate is connected to energy. How much energy will it take for us to change something? And then when they're all mapped together, we get an idea where we've got how much energy and how much time will it take to make something change. Say, for example, let's look. So if we look at the bottom left-hand corner here, which I've marked as volatile, imagine that there's something here, something happening, an opportunity, or maybe a constraint. Maybe it's related to people, or could be our customers. It could be all kinds of things. You can map whatever you want, really. But in this situation, what we're saying is change could happen very, very quickly. It could happen spontaneously at this stage, because the amount of energy and the amount of time necessary to make a change is very limited. So it could just flip like that. So that's a volatile period of change. However, at the other end, we've got the counterfactual. I suppose we could say that this is the almost impossible level of change. The amount of time, the amount of energy that it would take to change these factors almost makes it not worth the bother. However, in the middle, we've got, and this is the word that Snowden uses as well, the liminal space, which is the space where change is more, where space can happen, and where we can manage a situation to create affordances for change. So this could be a whole range of different things. This could be through teacher education. This could be through marketing to customers to make them more aware of situations. It could be just design of curricula, even classrooms, to make things different. So basically it's a narrative approach. So it's about telling the story in a different way. So what have we got? Well, as David Snowden says, human systems, like a school, are very messy. And as I said right at the start, for most of us in a room like this today, the idea that native speaker and non-native speaker teachers both have valuable qualities that can offer a lot to our school, maybe that argument is probably already won for us. However, we know that that's not necessarily the case in the rest of the world, where governments, customers, all kinds of people, even sometimes the teachers themselves, they don't agree. And so if we're looking for ways to tell the story, to make the change, we need to start with a sense of direction, which means that we are aware of possibilities that could happen, maybe even some pathways that can lead them to us. But we need to be able to do them in ways that are responsive to the fact that the world is a complex place and it doesn't change easily sometimes. So, thank you very much for listening. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like to see this again, because I know it's all gone very, very quickly, or to read some of these articles that I base my talk on, you can find the links and my LinkedIn site. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.